Hi, the first slide is basically just the relationship between unemployment and inflation. If the unemployment rates are lower, then inflation will most likely occur. And this is basically because consumers would be making more money and then using that money to purchase goods and services. If the unemployment rate is high, people can afford to spend money and therefore inflation is also down. The second slide is basically just what exactly inflation is. And inflation is a sustained increase in the general price of and level of goods and services in the economy over a period of time. When the general price level rises, each unit of currency buys fewer goods and services. The third slide is just a cause of inflation, and one of these two would be the demand pull inflation. This is a term used in Keynesian economics to describe the scenario that occurs when price levels rise because of an imbalance in the aggregate supply and demand. When the aggregate demand in an economy is strongly outweighs the aggregate supply, prices increase. This slide shows basically that inflation can be caused by something else, and this would be cost push inflation. This occurs when the price level of inputs increase. Businesses must acquire raw materials, labor, energy, and capital to operate. But if these price levels were to rise, it would reduce the ability of producers to generate output because their unit cost of production has increased. If their increases in production costs are relatively large, the effect is that it creates higher inflation, reduces real GDP, and increases the unemployment rate. So obviously inflation is pretty notorious for reducing the value of money in the economy. Savings accounts are affected negatively. If the interest paid on your savings account is more than the level of inflation, your purchasing power will have less value. So basically, if the inflation rate is 3% and your account pays 5% interest, you are gaining a net of 2%. However, if the inflation rate is at 5% and your account only pays 3%, you will lose purchasing power on your account. This was a problem in Germany in 1923 throughout the Weimar Republic, where people began to burn money and use it as fuel. Inflation basically reached such a high level that the money in the republic was worth virtually nothing. They began burning the money to use it as fuel and other resources because it meant so little to them. Obviously, inflation has a serious effect on society and countries as a whole. So the seventh slide basically shows just a picture of someone who needs work. And unemployment is very prevalent among every single country around the world. It is defined as the state of being unemployed. This would mean that certain people are basically without jobs. This state is often combined with either too much inflation or a lack of inflation. There are a couple graphs in the next few slides to help portray this relationship. So the short run Phillips curve is one of the graphs that I will be talking about. It helps to portray the indirect relationship between inflation and unemployment. And as you can see, the percentage or the rate of either the inflation or the unemployment are indirectly related. When inflation increases, unemployment tends to decrease. And when inflation decreases, unemployment tends to increase. When this graph or the line on the graph shifts one way or another, it helps to indicate a change in either inflation or unemployment, which affects our economy in a major way. These shifts in the short run Phillips curve often depend on the aggregate demand curve as it moves the economy along the short run aggregate supply curve. So the greater the aggregate demand for the goods and services, which is basically how much people want the goods and services, the greater the economy's output and therefore at a higher price level. When the economy is producing more output, there's a lower level of unemployment. As you can see in this graph, CPI is a pretty good judge of price level and how consumers are directly affected by the inflation. As GDP goes up in the supply and demand graph, the point of the equilibrium shifts upwards towards the price level, indicating that there is an increase in inflation. The increase of GDP indicates that jobs are being made, thus a decrease in unemployment. The higher the prices also relate to the decrease in unemployment, but there's an obvious trade-off between the two. So obviously, of anything, there are expectations, and the expectations of the short-run Phillips curve depend on the change in inflation. So in a case where people expect the short-run Phillips curve to change, then they also expect the overall price level to change. So if the price level changes with no warning, there could be problems among society, and people could be very unhappy, as expected. So obviously, when people get things that they don't expect, there's a bit of a ruckus going on in society. And basically, that is what supply shock is. It is an unexpected event that changes the supply of a product or commodity, resulting in a sudden change in its price. Supply shocks are typically negative but can also be positive and increase supply. However, they are almost always negative and rarely positive. Assuming aggregate demand is unchanged, a negative supply shock on a product or commodity will cause its price to spike upward, while a positive supply shock will exert downward pressure on its price and relieve it. This is basically a graph to help portray how the shift occurs when a supply shock is prevalent. So the supply shock in this scenario is changing the aggregate supply of a given commodity. And as the supply changes, the price level of the goods spikes dramatically, and the quantity of the good being produced decreases. This supply shock would cause an overall increase in both inflation and in unemployment. Supply shock has the ability of causing something called stagflation. The definition of stagflation is when the economy isn't growing, but the prices definitely are. This occurred to our nation during the 70s. World oil prices basically rose dramatically, which fueled sharp inflation in developed countries such as ours. And for these countries, stagflation created many unwanted inflationary effects. Um, the long-run Phillips curve is basically something that is not related directly to the changes in inflation and unemployment. The long-run Phillips curve is typically used to measure the natural rate of unemployment among a given society. The natural rate of unemployment can be defined as the lowest level of unemployment at which inflation remains stable, also known as the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. So basically, as with anything, there's a cost to reducing or increasing anything. So when we try to reduce inflation, basically what happens is we reduce the inflation, but in turn we get a very, very high rate of unemployment because the Fed tries to go against the increasing amount of inflation that we already have. Thankfully enough, we can breathe a sigh of relief because the natural rate hypothesis is basically something that views that unemployment eventually returns to its natural rate, regardless of what happens with inflation. Um, this is basically proven by historical observations and what we've basically seen in the past. Clearly, due to the indirect relationship between unemployment and inflation, it is very difficult for our economy to stay stable, constantly changing inflation and unemployment to try to find the best things that coincide. Um, so hopefully, as we venture into the future, we'll be able to find something that stabilizes our economy, and we don't have to do things that increase or decrease inflation too much anymore.